It was early fall when we decided to spend a weekend at my friend's family cabin. It sat deep in the woods of northern Michigan, far from the nearest town, surrounded by thick trees and a long dirt road that hadn't seen much use in years. The cabin itself was old, built by his grandfather decades ago. It had that classic log look, with a slanted tin roof that popped and groaned at night when the air turned cold. I remember how the first evening we got there, everything felt calm. The sun went down behind the trees, the air smelled like pine and smoke, and the only sound was the crackle of the small fire we made out back. There were 5 of us in total. We unloaded our gear, filled the small kitchen with groceries, and set up sleeping bags on the floor in the main room. It was a cozy space, wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a few old deer heads mounted above us, and shelves stacked with faded family photos. The only thing that felt off, even from the start, was the attic. It had a square door built into the ceiling near the kitchen. The door was small, with a few nails hammered across it. My friend told us it had been sealed that way for years. Supposedly, the attic was full of old junk and the family had never bothered cleaning it out. Nobody thought much of it that night. The first sign that something was wrong came on the second night. It was sometime around midnight when I woke up. The fire in the fireplace had burned down to red coals, and the cabin was nearly pitch dark except for the glow. The woods outside were silent, not even the sound of insects. I lay there, half asleep, when I heard something above me. It wasn't loud, but it was clear footsteps. Slow, steady steps moving across the ceiling. At first, I thought it was the building settling, but the sound had rhythm like actual pacing. It lasted maybe 20 seconds, then stopped. I stayed frozen, staring up at the dark ceiling, waiting to hear it again. The next morning, I told myself it was my imagination. We had hiked most of the day before and I was tired. But that night, around the same time, it happened again. The same heavy, deliberate steps directly overhead. I stared up at the ceiling for a long time, my mind trying to find a logical reason. There were no raccoons or squirrels that could make steps that distinct. And the sound came from the center of the attic, not the edges near the roof where animals might crawl. By the third night, all of us had noticed it. The footsteps were becoming a regular thing. Sometimes they'd last for several minutes, walking from one end of the cabin to the other, pausing above certain spots as if whoever or whatever it was standing there listening. We didn't talk about it much during the day, trying to laugh it off. But when the sun went down, every small creak made our skin crawl. One evening, I decided to look closer at the attic door. The nails looked old, rusted in place, and the wood around them was dusty. But something about the edges of the door caught my attention. The dust wasn't even. There were faint smudge marks, like someone had touched or moved it recently. I brushed my finger across the frame and noticed that the dust came off easily, leaving clean streaks beneath. It bothered me enough that I started to notice other strange little things. A few bags of chips we'd brought were missing from the counter. I figured maybe one of the others had eaten them late at night, but nobody admitted to it. A pack of bottled water that we'd left by the door seemed lighter than before. Even a few energy bars from my backpack had disappeared. It wasn't until I noticed a faint smell, cigarette smoke, that everything started to click. None of us smoked. The smell would come and go randomly, usually late at night, faint but distinct enough to notice. The following night, the steps came back louder than ever. I could hear the wood boards above us creak in long, slow movements. It didn't sound like someone sneaking. It sounded like someone who lived up there, like they knew we couldn't reach them. I barely slept that night, every sound making my chest tighten. The next morning, I checked the attic door again. I stood on a chair and looked closely at the edges. One of the nails looked like it had been moved. It wasn't fully in, it was slightly bent. That's when the feeling of unease turned into something deeper, something heavier. It wasn't just an old house creaking. Someone was up there. By the last day, curiosity mixed with fear. We wanted to leave, but there was this nagging thought that we had to know what was really happening. The attic door wasn't far from the kitchen counter, and my friend found a claw hammer in one of the drawers. The nails came out easier than I expected, the old wood splintering slightly as we pried them loose. When we finally pulled the attic door open, A wave of cold, musty air spilled down. The opening was small, barely big enough to climb through. I shone a flashlight into the darkness. Dust floated in the beam, swirling in the still air. The first thing I saw were old boxes, some stacked, some collapsed. But behind them, something didn't look right. The insulation on one side of the attic was pushed out in a strange shape. I climbed up, my knees sinking into the wooden planks, and moved closer. That's when I saw it. A rolled-up sleeping bag wedged behind the insulation, barely visible unless you looked directly at it. The fabric looked newer than anything else in that attic, dark blue and only lightly covered in dust. Around it were piles of trash, fast food wrappers, empty water bottles, and cigarette butts pressed into small piles of ash. Someone had been living up there not long ago, maybe even while we were there. I kept the flashlight steady as I looked around. There were footprints in the dust, two clear impressions leading from one end of the attic to the other. Some of them looked fresh, as if made within the past few days. One corner had a small pile of blankets, a half-eaten granola bar still sitting on top of a flattened box. The realization hit me hard. While we were sleeping, eating, and going about our days, someone had been hiding just feet above us. They had listened to us move around, probably waiting for the right moments to sneak down and take what they needed. That explained the missing food, the cigarette smell, the noises at night. Whoever it was must have been watching carefully, living quietly enough to stay unnoticed until now. The air up there was stale, full of the smell of sweat and smoke. It felt wrong standing there, like I was intruding into someone's hidden world. The space felt cramped and claustrophobic, and the thought of someone lying there, night after night, listening to us below, made my skin crawl. When I climbed back down, the others looked pale, like they already knew what I'd seen. We didn't say much. We packed our stuff as quickly as we could. The walk from the cabin to the car felt longer than before. Every sound from the trees made me turn my head. When we finally started driving down that narrow dirt road, I remember looking back through the rear window. The cabin sat there quietly, surrounded by trees, the sunlight flickering through the leaves. The drive back felt tense. None of us spoke the whole way. The thought that we might have been sharing that cabin with someone unknown, someone desperate enough to live above us, sat in my mind for days afterward. Later that week, my friend told me his family went back to check the place. They found the attic empty again. No sleeping bag, no trash, nothing. Just dust and the faint smell of smoke. I still think about that a lot. How easily someone could live so close, so silently, and go unnoticed. The sound of footsteps in that cabin stuck with me. Sometimes, when I'm lying awake at night and I hear the faintest creak from above, I can't help but picture that attic again. Dark, narrow, and full of quiet breathing I'll never hear but somehow still know is there. I went up to the old family hunting cabin alone in early November, right before the snow started to fall heavy that year. The place had been in the family for decades, though no one had really used it since my grandfather passed away. It sat about a mile off an old logging road, hidden deep in the woods where cell service died completely and the silence could stretch for hours. My father used to take me there when I was a kid, mostly in summer. Back then it felt bigger, almost warm, even with the creaky floors and the smell of pine sap and old smoke. Going back as an adult, it felt different, smaller, darker, heavier. I brought just the essentials: food, water, a sleeping bag, my rifle, and a small generator in case the old wiring gave out. I wanted a few quiet days, maybe some hunting, maybe just time away from everything. The first night was uneventful. I made a fire, cooked a can of chili, and spent most of the evening cleaning up the place. It was dusty and cold, but still solid. The wood stove worked fine, the roof didn't leak, and most of the furniture was where I remembered it. There was one room, though, that I didn't remember, at least not the way it looked now. In the back corner near the small hallway, there was a narrow door I thought was just a closet. When I opened it, the smell of dry dust and old fabric hit me. The space was small, barely wide enough to walk into, filled with tools, cracked paint cans, and some old boxes stacked against the far wall. And standing in the corner, slumped slightly to one side, was what looked like a scarecrow. first, I actually laughed a little. It was made of sticks and straw inside torn, filthy clothes. The head was a burlap sack tied loosely with rope, and the whole thing was leaning at an awkward angle like it was about to collapse. The clothes looked old, maybe even from my grandfather's time. The shirt was a faded plaid, ripped at the sleeves, and the pants were stiff with grime. I figured maybe someone used it for target practice or as a joke decoration. There were old bullet holes in the wall behind it, so that seemed likely. It was eerie, sure, but I didn't think much of it. I left it there and shut the door. The rest of the weekend I kept busy chopping wood, checking the traps left by the last visitor, and just enjoying the quiet. At night, the wind picked up enough to make the trees moan, but that wasn't new. By the third morning, something small but strange caught my attention. I had opened the closet to grab a toolbox, and the scarecrow wasn't standing quite the same way. It was subtle. The head was turned slightly to the right, facing more toward the doorway than before. I thought maybe I'd brushed against it, or maybe the draft from opening the door had made it shift. I adjusted it back and didn't think much more of it. That night, I went to sleep early. The wind outside was stronger, and now and then I heard branches scratching against the cabin walls. The sound didn't bother me much. I'd grown up hearing it. But at some point in the middle of the night, I woke up with a strange feeling, like something in the room had changed. I couldn't hear anything specific, just that uneasy stillness where you know you're awake but don't want to move. After a while, I fell back asleep. When I woke again at dawn, I went to the kitchen to make coffee. On my way, I glanced toward the back hallway and noticed the closet door was slightly open, just a few inches, enough to see the edge of the door frame. I was sure I'd closed it all the way the day before. When I opened it, the scarecrow was facing almost directly toward the door now. The head was tilted slightly upward, and the shoulders seemed more squared than before, as if someone had adjusted it. The air in that little closet felt heavier, still smelling of dry straw and dust. I stared at it for a long time, trying to figure out what was happening. I looked around for signs of animals. Maybe mice or squirrels had gotten in somehow, but there was no hole, no droppings, nothing disturbed. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Things looked different in dim light after all. Still, I didn't like it. I shut the door firmly and pushed a small box against it. Later that day, I went for a walk through the woods, following one of the old trails that led down to the creek. The air was sharp and cold, and the woods felt dead quiet except for the wind through the branches. I tried to shake off the weird feeling from that morning, but it stuck with me. The image of that thing, turned just slightly toward the door, kept coming back to me. When I returned around mid-afternoon, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The closet door was open again. The box I'd pushed against it was tipped over onto its side. Inside, the scarecrow was now positioned differently. It was closer to the door, maybe a foot closer. It was still upright, still silent, but it wasn't where I remembered it standing. I could see faint marks in the dust on the floor, as if something heavy had been dragged forward. I stared at it for a long time, not wanting to step closer. My hands were cold, but I could feel sweat under my jacket. I told myself maybe I hadn't pushed the box far enough and the door had blown open from the wind. Maybe the cabin had shifted from the temperature change. The old wood floors did move sometimes, but even as I tried to make sense of it, I couldn't explain how the thing had moved that far or why the dust showed clear drag marks. That night, I barely slept. Every small sound made my eyes snap open. The creak of the cabin, the groan of the roof, the tapping of branches outside. At one point, I thought I heard a soft scraping from the hallway, like something brushing against wood. I lay still, holding my breath until my heartbeat slowed. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. The next morning, I didn't even want to check, but I had to. The first thing I saw when I stepped into the hallway was the closet door, wide open. The scarecrow was standing right at the threshold now, half in shadow, half in the light from the window. It wasn't all the way upright anymore. It leaned slightly forward, as if mid-step, the burlap head tilted toward the floor. I could see the straw poking out from the wrists of the torn shirt and the way the fabric hung loose and damp from the moisture in the air. For a long moment, I couldn't move. It was just standing there, lifeless, but everything about it screamed wrong. My brain tried to reason through it, Earth tremors, air pressure, temperature changes, but none of that could move something that size. Then I noticed something else. The wood at the base of the figure's pants wasn't straw. It was boot leather. Old, cracked leather, coated in dust but unmistakably real boots. My stomach sank. I forced myself closer, flashlight in hand, and saw it more clearly now. There were remnants of something beneath the straw, a shape, a density that wasn't all stuffing. I pulled the edge of the shirt back just slightly and froze. Under the fabric, near the collarbone, was a strip of dark brown, leathery skin. Not fresh, but not ancient either. Something in between. My whole body went cold. I staggered back, nearly tripping over the box I'd knocked aside. It wasn't a scarecrow. It wasn't even a mannequin. Someone had dressed up a body, maybe a hunter, maybe a trespasser, and left it to dry out like a prop. Over time, the clothes and straw must have hidden it well enough that no one ever looked closely. The slow shifts in position made sense now in a horrifying way. The cabin wasn't perfectly level, and the floorboards sometimes warped with humidity. If the body had been loosely balanced on one side, it could have slowly tilted or slumped forward over the course of days as the temperature and moisture changed. The subtle movements, the way it seemed to lean closer each morning, that had been gravity, not intent. I couldn't stay another minute. I packed my things, threw them in the truck, and left before the sun fully came up. I drove until I had service, called the sheriff's office, and told them what I'd found. They sent a team out that afternoon. Later, they confirmed it had been a man, dead for at least 15, maybe 20 years. The body had been dressed up, stuffed with straw and rags, left in that closet probably long before I ever started visiting as a kid. Nobody could identify him. The remains were too far gone. The cause of death was never made public, but the officer I spoke to said quietly that it looked like he'd been shot once, high in the chest. I haven't gone back since. The cabin was sealed off for investigation and eventually torn down. Sometimes I think about it at night, the quiet creak of those old floors, the slow shift of that figure in the dark closet. I tell myself it was all just physics, the slow collapse of a body left standing too long. But the image that won't leave my head is that last morning, the way it stood halfway out of the closet, as if it had been waiting for me to finally see it for what it really was. The cabin had been in my uncle's name for years, an old hunting place tucked back in the woods near the base of a low ridge. It wasn't fancy, just one room with a small stove, a narrow bed, a rusted sink, and a table that leaned a little to one side. He hadn't used it much after his knees went bad, and when he mentioned I could spend a weekend there to get some quiet, I took the offer. I needed space and I liked being alone. The drive out there took hours, ending on a dirt track that was barely wide enough for my truck. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun was already low, shining gold through the trees and catching the dust in the air. The cabin looked exactly how I remembered it from when I was a kid. Weathered gray wood, a tin roof streaked with rust, and the smell of pine needles and damp earth all around. The woods behind it grew thick, the kind that swallows light as soon as the sun dips. Felt peaceful at first. I unpacked, checked the little wood stove, and filled a pot from the old hand pump outside. Inside, everything creaked but held firm. The walls were lined with old hunting trophies and faded photos, and the only window was beside the bed. Just a small one with a crooked frame and fogged glass. That first night was calm. The forest outside was loud with crickets, and a breeze brushed against the cabin walls. I turned in early, the bed springs squeaking beneath me as I shifted. The woods at night always make noise. Branches crack, animals move, and the wind can make things sound closer than they are. Sometime past midnight, I woke up to a faint sound. It was soft, steady, almost delicate, a faint scraping coming from the wall beside me. It sounded like something dragging lightly against the outer boards. I lay there in the dark, listening. The sound would come for a few seconds, then stop, then come again. My first thought was that it was a branch swaying in the wind, brushing against the cabin. But the sound was too precise, too rhythmic. Still, it didn't seem worth getting up for. The cabin was old. Noises were part of it. I turned on my side and forced myself to go back to sleep. In the morning, I walked around the outside to check. There were no branches near that wall, nothing close enough to scrape it. The ground below was bare dirt mixed with pine needles. I didn't see any tracks or marks, so I brushed it off as maybe a raccoon or a porcupine nosing around during the night. The next night, the scraping came again. It started just as I was about to fall asleep. Same spot, same slow, dragging motion against the wood, maybe a foot or so above the floor, right where my head rested on the other side. I lay there, holding my breath, listening. It went on longer this time, scrape, pause, scrape again. There was something unsettling about how steady it was, like someone was doing it intentionally, keeping time. The air inside the cabin felt heavier as I waited for it to stop. When it finally did, I stared at the wall for a long time before I could close my eyes. The following morning, I checked again. Still nothing. No prints, no damage I could see. But the sound had been too close, too deliberate. I remember feeling uneasy the entire day, walking the tree line behind the cabin, scanning for anything strange. The woods stretched for miles. Dense pine, birch, and undergrowth thick enough that you couldn't see more than a few yards ahead. There were signs of deer, maybe a fox, but nothing that made sense of the sound. That evening, I locked the door, even though I doubted anyone else was within miles. I ate a simple dinner, read for a while, and tried to ignore how early the darkness fell. Around midnight, it came again. The scraping, only this time it sounded slower, heavier. I could almost picture the motion. A hard edge dragging along the wood, stopping, then dragging again. My chest felt tight, my mouth dry. I didn't move. I just stared up at the ceiling, waiting. The sound stopped suddenly, and then there was silence for the rest of the night. By morning, I was exhausted. I went outside again, walking slowly along the side of the cabin near my bed. That's when I saw them. Deep, thin grooves cut into the wood. Not scratches like from an animal's claws, but long, deliberate marks, like someone had taken a knife and dragged it along the siding. They were fresh, the wood lighter in color where the blade had stripped away the outer layer. There were several lines parallel, right at the height of where my head would have been while I was sleeping inside. The realization made my stomach twist. Someone had been standing just feet away from me, outside the wall, dragging a blade right where I lay sleeping. It hadn't been an animal. It was a person. I felt sick thinking about it. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too exposed. The woods that had seemed peaceful before now looked endless and full of places for someone to hide. I spent the day on edge, checking the tree line every few minutes, scanning for movement. I saw nothing. No footprints around the cabin, no sign of anyone having been there. The dirt near the wall was undisturbed except for faint impressions that could have been anything. Shadows, maybe old marks. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching, maybe even waiting for me to fall asleep again. That night, I didn't sleep. I dragged the small table across the room, wedging it against the door. I kept my flashlight close, my boots on. The cabin was silent except for the faint ticking of the stove cooling off. Hours passed in near total darkness, the woods outside completely still. Then, sometime around 3 in the morning, I heard it again. That same slow, scraping sound, but softer this time, almost hesitant. I held my breath and gripped the flashlight, staring at the wall. It went on for a few seconds, then stopped. Then came a faint creak of the porch outside, the sound of weight shifting on the old boards. Whoever it was, they were standing right there. I could feel the air in the cabin tighten, like the silence itself was pressing in. Then, nothing. The sound didn't return for the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I went outside immediately. The knife marks were deeper now, fresh shavings of wood lying at the base of the wall. The air smelled faintly of metal and damp wood. I followed the side of the cabin toward the woods, scanning the ground. About 20 feet out, I found the faint outline of a boot print in the soft dirt, partly smudged but clear enough to know it wasn't mine, pointed toward the trees. I stood there for a long time trying to decide what to do. The nearest neighbor was miles away, and there was no cell service out there. I packed my things quickly, loaded them into the truck, and started the engine. I remember the way the sound of the motor echoed off the trees, breaking that heavy silence that had hung over the place for days. I didn't look back until I was at the end of the dirt road, when the cabin was barely visible through the trees. When I finally reached town hours later, I stopped at a gas station and stood outside for a while, just breathing. It took me a long time to shake that feeling that someone had been right there with me at night, not trying to break in, not trying to talk, but just standing outside, dragging a knife along the wall where my head had been. Later, when I told my uncle about it, he said the cabin had been broken into once years ago. Some drifter had been sleeping there during the winters, living off whatever he could find. He thought maybe someone like that had come back. Maybe they didn't expect anyone to be there that weekend. Maybe the scraping was a warning or a way to scare me off. Whatever the reason, I never went back. The thought of lying in that bed again, with only a thin wall between me and whoever had been outside, is something I can't even imagine doing now. Sometimes, when I'm half asleep at home and the house shifts or something brushes against the window, I still hear it. The faint, slow scrape of metal on wood, and I picture those deep knife marks, carved right where my head had rested. A quiet reminder that someone had been out there watching me through the dark, close enough to touch the wall, close enough to reach through it if they'd wanted to. We drove up to the cabin just after a light snowfall had covered everything in a clean white sheet. The air was sharp and cold, the kind that burned your nose when you breathed in too deep. The trees were heavy with snow, and the road had been little more than tire ruts cutting through the forest. The cabin sat at the end of that road, a dark wooden shape half buried in drifts, smoke stained around the chimney and silent except for the wind. It was my girlfriend's uncle's place, an old hunting cabin that hadn't been used in a few winters. The plan was simple, just a weekend away from the noise of town, a small wood stove, some quiet, and maybe a walk through the frozen woods. Right away, something felt a little off. The driveway and steps were buried under fresh snow, but around the cabin, the snow wasn't untouched. All along the perimeter, there were footprints, hundreds of them, circling the cabin over and over. Some were clear and sharp, others softened by the wind, but they went around every wall, crossing paths and looping in strange circles. It looked like someone had been pacing, maybe for hours. I remember standing there for a moment, looking down at the prints, trying to understand what I was seeing. The tracks were deep enough to show the pattern of a boot sole, human-sized, but no two seemed to go in the same direction. We brushed it off as some locals messing around. The cabin wasn't far from a small town about a half-hour away, and it seemed possible that kids might wander out this way just to spook whoever stayed here. Still, it didn't feel like a prank. It looked too chaotic, too aimless. The prints weren't all the same depth either. Some were pressed hard, others shallow, like whoever made them had been walking there for a long time, stepping in the same places again and again. Inside, the cabin was exactly what you'd expect. Old furniture, faded curtains, a little stove with a metal pipe going up through the roof. There were blankets folded on the couch and a stack of firewood beside the door. The air smelled faintly of pine and dust, but it was dry and warmer than I expected once the fire caught. We unpacked, made a small meal, and tried to relax. The wind outside rose and fell, rattling the old windows and brushing snow from the branches. For a while, I forgot about the footprints, but later that night, when we stepped outside to grab more wood from the shed, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The snow around the cabin had changed. There were more prints now, new ones. They looked fresh, cleaner at the edges. They hadn't been there that afternoon. They were close to the cabin walls, so close that in some spots the snow was pressed flat against the siding. The wind had died down hours ago, which meant the prints had been made after dark, sometime while we were inside. I followed a few of them with my flashlight. They led all around the cabin again, circling, looping, sometimes overlapping so thickly it was hard to tell how many there were. But what stopped me cold was the pattern near the back wall. The prints went right up to the bedroom window, stopping inches from the glass. I could see where someone had stood there for a long time. The snow sunken deep in two oval patches, side by side, like boots planted firmly. There were no prints leading away from that spot, just those two deep marks staring back at me in the beam of the flashlight. The window itself was fogged from the inside, but faintly, I could see where the frost had been smudged, like a hand had pressed against it. My breath turned white in front of me as I stood there, realizing how close someone had been to where we were sleeping. I scanned the tree line, the shed, the road, but the woods were silent. No movement, just the sound of the wind shifting through the branches far above. Back inside, the fire had burned low. I sat for a long time, listening to the small creaks the cabin made. I told myself the prints had to be old ones I hadn't noticed before. The mind plays tricks when you're surrounded by nothing but silence. But the unease stayed with me. Every gust of wind sounded like footsteps outside. Every shift in the wood frame made me look toward the windows. I didn't sleep much that night. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy. Around what must have been 2 or 3 in the morning, I woke to the sound of something brushing lightly against the cabin wall. A faint rustling, then silence. Then again, closer to the window this time. It wasn't loud enough to be sure of what it was, and I didn't move. I just lay there staring at the dim outline of the frosted glass, my heartbeat slow and heavy in my ears. Eventually, the sound stopped, and the cold crept in enough that I must have drifted back to a shallow, uneasy sleep. When morning came, the sky was pale gray and the woods quiet again. I went outside before anything else, just to look. The first thing I noticed was that the prints around the cabin had multiplied again. They were everywhere, fresh, crisp, like someone had walked through the night in slow circles. But at the bedroom window, the same 2 deep prints were still there. Exactly the same. The snow around them had shifted slightly from the wind, but the boots hadn't moved. And again, there were no prints leading away. The rest of the day passed in a strange haze. The woods felt empty, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. Every time I went near the window, I thought about those 2 prints outside and the idea of someone standing there in the dark, close enough to see inside, maybe close enough to hear us breathe. That afternoon, I followed the old path that led down toward the frozen creek about a 1/4 mile away. The snow was untouched past the clearing. No other human tracks anywhere. It made the prints around the cabin even stranger. Whoever had made them had never come or gone by any visible path. It was like they'd appeared from nowhere and vanished the same way. By sunset, I decided I'd had enough. The plan was to leave early the next morning, but I couldn't shake the uneasiness that something wasn't right. I brought the remaining firewood inside and bolted the door. The cabin was small, 1 room, so the firelight filled it easily. I tried reading, tried listening to the wind, but my mind kept circling back to the same question. How could there be no tracks leading away? That night, it started again. Around midnight, I heard the faint crunch of snow outside. Not constant, but enough to make the hair on my arms rise. I didn't move for a long time, just listened. The sound was on and off, shifting from one side of the cabin to another, as if someone were slowly walking around it again. The floor creaked faintly beneath me as I sat up. The crunching stopped, and then the silence that followed was somehow worse. After a while, I forced myself to look through the window. The glass was fogged, and outside, the world was pale with moonlight. I couldn't see anyone, but the fresh layer of snow was covered in new footprints. Clear, crisp, circling again and again. And just like before, 2 prints stood out from the rest, pressed deep right outside the bedroom window. They were facing the glass. No others led away. I stayed awake until dawn, not daring to move, the fire burning down to embers. When the light finally came, I went outside one last time. The air was still, and the world looked calm, like nothing had ever happened. The new footprints were there, hundreds of them, looping and crossing over each other. The 2 prints at the window were filled slightly with blown snow, but the shape was unmistakable. When we left later that morning, I looked back at the cabin from the end of the drive. The wind had started picking up again, erasing the top layer of the prints, but the outlines still showed faintly through the drifting powder. I remember thinking that the woods looked almost peaceful again, quiet and harmless, hiding whatever had been there through the night. I never went back after that. My girlfriend's uncle sold the place a year later. He said some snowmobilers found old tracks leading from the property through the forest, heading north before disappearing into a frozen marsh. Nobody ever figured out who it was or how long they'd been coming around. But what stayed with me wasn't the thought of someone circling the cabin. It was those two footprints, standing there motionless in the snow, pressed right up to the window, as if whoever had made them wasn't looking in or watching, but waiting. And the thing that unsettles me most is knowing there were never any tracks leading away. Not once, not even after that last night. Just those same two deep prints, frozen in place, right outside the glass where we slept. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. The forecast had called for rain, maybe some wind, but nothing serious. I'd driven up to the cabin on Friday evening, hoping to get a couple days of solitude before heading back to work. It sat deep in the woods near the edge of a small lake, a place my uncle used to own before he passed it down to me. I'd been there plenty of times before, fishing in the summer, cutting wood in the fall. But this was my first trip up there in early spring, when the ground was still soft and the air still carried a bite of winter. The storm started not long after I arrived. Heavy rain came down in steady sheets, tapping against the tin roof and running off the edges like a waterfall. The wind moaned through the trees outside, bending the smaller ones until they scraped against the walls. The cabin shook slightly now and then, but I'd been through worse weather there. I got a fire going, made some soup, and tried to enjoy the sound of the rain. The cabin itself was small, just one main room, a narrow hallway, and a tiny kitchen tucked into the corner. The floorboards were old and uneven, the kind that creaked no matter how soft you walked. I'd always liked that sound. It reminded me that the place had history. But that night, as the storm grew louder, every small sound felt amplified. The wood popped, the roof rattled, and every gust of wind made me look toward the door without knowing why. Sometime after midnight, the power flickered and went out. The storm must have knocked something down. I wasn't worried. I had candles and an old flashlight in the drawer by the sink. I lit a couple candles, the glow making the kitchen feel smaller, more enclosed. The firelight from the stove flickered across the walls, and for a while, I just sat there, listening to the rain pound on the roof. That's when I noticed the draft. It came from somewhere near the floor, cold enough to make the candle flame quiver. I crouched down, feeling along the floorboards until my fingers brushed a faint seam near the far corner under the small rug. I pulled the rug back and found something I'd never seen before. There was a rectangular outline in the wood, a small hatch about 2 feet wide, set flush with the floor. I'd been in that cabin dozens of times, swept that very spot more than once, and I had never noticed it. The edges were worn and nearly invisible under the grime of years. I brushed at it and the outline became clearer. There was a small metal ring set into the wood, the kind you could pull up with your fingers. For a moment, I just stared at it, listening to the wind howl outside. The air coming from the crack was cold and earthy, like damp soil. I hesitated, but curiosity got the better of me. I hooked my fingers through the ring and pulled. The hatch came up with a groan of stiff hinges, releasing a musty smell that was thick and stale, like something that hadn't been opened in decades. Beneath it was darkness, and the faint shape of a wooden ladder leading down. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it into the hole. The beam lit a narrow dirt chamber, only about 6 feet deep and maybe 10 feet across. The walls were packed earth, uneven and raw. I could see what looked like old crates or boxes pushed against one side, along with scraps of what might have once been fabric. It didn't make any sense. There was no mention of a cellar or storage pit in any of the notes my uncle had left with the property. I'd been through every corner of that cabin, but never seen a hatch or ladder like this. The thought that I'd been walking over it all these years without knowing made my stomach twist. The rain hammered harder as I climbed down, one rung at a time, the wood of the ladder soft and slightly damp under my boots. The air grew colder the lower I went, thick with that same earthy smell. When I reached the bottom, I swept the flashlight beam slowly across the space. It was small and low, just tall enough to stand in if I hunched. The floor was hard-packed dirt with a few scattered objects half buried in it. Old food cans, some crushed, others rusted through. Pieces of torn cloth that looked like shirts or pants, and a few glass jars turned cloudy from age. In the corner, half hidden behind one of the crates, was a metal lantern. It was an old kerosene type, the kind with a glass chimney and a small handle. The metal was rusted in spots, but it didn't look ancient. What made me stop cold was that when I picked it up, it was warm. Not hot, not even particularly warm in the air, but just enough that I could feel the faint heat against my palm. I froze. I hadn't lit it. The power was out, and there was no reason for it to be warm. The chamber itself was cold enough that my breath was visible. I stood there, holding the lantern, trying to think of a logical reason. Maybe it had absorbed heat from the flashlight beam. Maybe it was reacting to the air. But the metal was distinctly warm, like it had been held recently. I set it down and looked around again, my flashlight trembling a little in my hand. The dirt floor showed faint impressions, marks like someone had moved around down there. Not deep footprints, but enough to suggest the space hadn't been untouched for as long as it looked. A few of the cans had been crushed more recently, the edges cleaner where the rust had split. I noticed an old tin plate with the faint trace of something dried and dark on it, and a piece of rope hanging loosely from one of the beams above. The longer I stood there, the more wrong it felt. The air was too still, the silence too heavy, as if the storm outside couldn't reach this deep. I took one last look around before climbing back up the ladder. When I reached the top, I pulled the hatch closed and pushed the rug back over it, feeling like I needed to cover it, to hide it again. For the rest of the night, I couldn't relax. The wind beat against the windows, the walls creaked, and the fire in the stove hissed quietly. I kept glancing toward the kitchen, half expecting the rug to move or the hatch to shift. Every sound made my heart jump a little. Around 3 in the morning, the storm started to ease, and I must have drifted in and out of shallow sleep. When I woke, it was early and gray outside. The rain had stopped, leaving a thin mist over the trees. I sat up, trying to shake the heavy feeling that had settled in my chest. My first thought was to check the hatch again, to make sure it was really there, that I hadn't imagined it. I walked to the kitchen. The rug was still in place, the floor cold under my bare feet. I lifted the rug and pulled the hatch open again. The smell hit me instantly, stale, damp, like the air had been sealed for years. But when I aimed the flashlight down, something was different. The lantern was gone. I stared at the dirt floor for a long time, my mind blank. The old cans were still there, the clothes still in piles, but the spot where I'd left the lantern was empty. There was a faint mark where it had sat, a clean circle in the dust. Nothing else looked disturbed. No footprints. No sign that anything had climbed out or been moved around. But it was just gone. I checked around the cabin, every corner, even outside on the porch. Nothing. The storm had left the ground wet and muddy, but there were no footprints leading away. No sign that anyone had come or gone. I packed up not long after that. The drive back through the woods was slow, the trees dripping with rain, the road soft with mud. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than they should have. Even miles from the cabin, I kept thinking about that hatch, about how I'd never seen it before, how the air had felt down there, how the lantern had been warm. Later that week, I called a local handyman who'd worked on the place before and asked him if he knew anything about a hidden cellar under the kitchen. He said no, there wasn't one on any of the plans he'd seen. When I asked if anyone else had stayed there recently, he said it had been empty for months. I haven't gone back since. I still have the keys, still think about the place every now and then when it rains hard and the wind shakes my windows. I keep telling myself that there must be a simple explanation for it. For the hatch, for the things I found, for the warm metal of that lantern. But the image that won't leave my mind is the empty space where I'd left it. Someone had been down there. Maybe not that night, maybe not for long, but someone had used that space recently enough for the metal to still hold heat. And the thought that they might have been close enough to hear me moving around above them, unaware they were right under my feet, is something I can't stop thinking about even now. The cabin sat at the end of a long, winding gravel road that cut through dense pine forest. When we booked it online, the photos made it look perfect, small, clean, tucked between trees, with a big deck facing a quiet lake. It looked peaceful in that isolated kind of way that city people like me usually find romantic. It was listed as an old family place turned into an Airbnb, about 45 minutes from the nearest town. The description mentioned a true getaway, And it really was. Once we pulled up, I realized there were no other houses, no lights, nothing but forest all around us. Even cell service dropped out halfway up the road. Inside, the cabin had that cozy, rustic feel. Wood walls, a small fireplace, old furniture that probably came from the owner's grandparents. It smelled faintly of pine and smoke. There was a binder sitting on the kitchen counter, the kind hosts usually leave with instructions, checkout times, and a guest book filled with messages from previous visitors. We flipped through it while unpacking. Most entries were normal. Notes about how peaceful it was, how they loved the lake, how they wished they could stay longer. But as I read further back, I started noticing something that popped up again and again, written in different handwriting. Small mentions about sounds at night. One entry said something like, "Love the cabin, though the tapping on the windows the first night freaked us out. Haha." Another said, "We didn't sleep well. Someone was knocking on the windows around midnight. Must have been branches or something." One of the oldest entries had it written more directly, "Whoever rents this next, just know there's someone knocking on the windows at night. It's not the wind." At first, it seemed like a running joke, something guests wrote to mess with whoever came next. I didn't think much about it. The place was surrounded by trees. It made sense that a branch or even an animal could hit the glass. The windows weren't new, and the wind-up here moved through the forest hard at night. The first evening was calm. We made a fire, cooked dinner, and listened to the rain start to fall. The sound of water on the roof mixed with the crackle of firewood, and the forest outside went completely black. There were no other lights in sight, no faint glow of neighboring houses. When we turned off the lamps, the darkness pressed right up against the windows. Felt heavy, endless, like being underwater. The next morning, we walked down to the lake. The air was cold and the water perfectly still, a flat gray mirror. The cabin looked smaller from a distance, its windows like black eyes set into the wood. It really was in the middle of nowhere, miles of forest in every direction. That second night, the rain came back harder. The trees bent with the wind, and the sound of branches scraping along the roof mixed with the dull patter of water. We sat by the fire until late, then finally went to bed. The bedroom was small, with one window right beside the bed that looked out toward the trees. We left the curtains open because there wasn't anything to see except darkness anyway. Sometime after midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why at first, just that quiet, half-conscious awareness that something was different. The storm had slowed down, and the only sound was the rain dripping from the trees outside. I lay there in the dark for a minute, trying to fall back asleep, and that's when I heard it. A light tapping sound. It came from the window right beside the bed. Slow, irregular. Tap, pause, tap, tap, then silence. At first, I thought it had to be a branch. The wind could have blown something against the glass. But then it came again, softer this time, almost gentle. Tap, tap, tap. Not scraping, not random. The sound was too steady, too intentional. I stayed still, just listening. My heartbeat got louder in my ears than the rain outside. It went on like that for maybe half a minute, soft, slow, deliberate tapping. I wanted to tell myself it was the wind or a loose shutter, but I knew the window didn't have shutters, and there wasn't a single branch close enough to touch that side of the cabin. I didn't get up. I just lay there frozen, staring into the dark where I knew the window was. I couldn't see anything. The sound stopped after a while, and eventually, I must have fallen back asleep without realizing. When the sun came up, the storm had passed. Everything outside was wet and shining, the trees dripping with water. I walked over to the window, still half thinking maybe it really had been a branch hitting it in the wind. But as soon as I looked closer, my stomach dropped. There were handprints on the glass. They were on the outside, faint but clear, smeared with mud. 5 fingers, small, thin. Not from an adult. They were the size of a child's hands, pressed right against the pane at the height where someone small would have stood. There were several of them, some overlapping, some streaked downward like they'd been dragging along the glass. I stood there for a long time just staring at them. They looked fresh. The mud hadn't dried completely yet. I opened the door and stepped out into the cold morning air. The ground was soft from rain, muddy near the walls, and sure enough, There were footprints leading around the cabin. They were small too, barefoot. You could see the individual toes pressed into the soft earth. They circled the cabin, a few near the back steps, a few by the window. I followed them for as long as I could before they disappeared into the wet grass near the tree line. The forest beyond the clearing looked normal, quiet, empty, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been standing there watching. The prints weren't deep, like from an adult's weight. They were light, almost delicate. Whoever it was, if it really was someone, had to be small, young, and barefoot in freezing mud. I went back inside and tried to calm myself down. There was nothing to do but think logically. Maybe a neighbor's kid? Maybe someone's child wandering too far from home? But there were no neighbors for miles. The listing had said no other homes within view. The host's family didn't even live nearby. The more I thought about it, the less sense it made. All day, I kept thinking about those muddy prints on the window. The idea of a kid being out there in the cold, barefoot, made no sense. The air barely climbed above freezing. I walked the perimeter again that afternoon and didn't find any new tracks. Everything was quiet again, still. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every small sound made my pulse jump. The wind, the creak of the old wood, the rustle of pine needles. Around 3 in the morning, I found myself staring at the ceiling, counting seconds between distant drips of rain. Then I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Slow like before. The sound came from the same window right beside the bed. I didn't move. I just listened. The tapping went on longer this time, with pauses in between, always slow, like someone tracing a pattern on the glass. After a few minutes, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. I didn't look, couldn't. When daylight came, I forced myself to check again. More prints, fresh ones this time. The same size, same shape. New smears of wet dirt on the glass. The footprints outside were clearer too, cutting across the muddy ground in a path that looped around the cabin before vanishing into the trees again. That morning, I packed up everything. I didn't wait for the third night. The silence in that place didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt watched. I loaded the car and drove until I saw the first road sign back toward town. When I finally got service, I sent a message to the host, telling them someone had been around the cabin at night and that they should probably check it out. They responded hours later, thanking me and saying they'd send someone. I never heard what came of it. I didn't want to. A few weeks later, though, curiosity got the better of me. I went back to the Airbnb page. The listing was still there, same photos, same description. But when I looked at the reviews, I saw new ones. One written just a few days after mine. It said, "Beautiful place, but weird things at night. We heard tapping on the windows around 3 a.m., thought it was animals until we found tiny muddy handprints outside in the morning. Looked like a child's. Still, we had a good stay." I scrolled back to the guestbook photos that someone had uploaded with their review. The last page showed a few handwritten entries from recent guests. One of them, dated right after my visit, said almost the same thing as the old ones. "If you hear knocking on the windows at night, don't bother checking. You won't see anyone." The words made my stomach turn, not because they sounded supernatural, but because I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. Small, barefoot, walking circles around the cabin in the freezing mud. Whoever they belonged to wasn't a ghost. Someone had been out there for real. Someone small enough to move quietly, old enough to wander in the dark, and close enough to press their hands against the glass, staring in while we slept. That image still comes back to me sometimes. The slow, deliberate tapping, the faint outline of tiny fingers in the morning light, and the endless forest beyond the window, where the prints disappeared into the trees like they always did.